Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 8th series of Structure from Logic of Sense. This chapter can appear very confusing at first glance, as Deleuze seems to assume a lot of background information on the part of the reader, or else perhaps hopes that the reader will dig a little to find out the context of his remarks here. In this chapter, he describes the structure behind the production of sense, which is based on these two kinds of series we've talked about previously. One series being that of the signifier, which always has a value of excess. The other being the signified, which always has a lack of some kind. I also believe that Deleuze provides a clue to the structure of this book, which we'll circle back to toward the end of this video as it occurs in the first paragraph. So he introduces a 20th century French anthropologist named Claude Levi-Strauss, who did a lot of work on the theory of structuralism and structural anthropology. And structuralism can be basically defined as the search for the underlying patterns of thought behind all human activity. It could be from Levi-Strauss where Deleuze came up with the structure for the production of sense, because he'll say that the excess in the one and the signifier and the lack in the signified refer to the series being in the perpetual disequilibrium and eternal displacement for one another. And the two adjectives, perpetual and eternal, sort of indicate the very general terms that Deleuze, or the very general subject matter that Deleuze talks about in this chapter. For instance, he begins with language, saying that the order of language is the primordial signifier. And that's the signified that correlates with that series of the order of language is what he calls knowledge. And he'll say that language is given all at once. The rules of language, you know the whole thing at one time, whereas knowledge is acquired incrementally or progressively from one part to the next. Deleuze sums this up by saying that the signified series organizes a preliminary totality. In his example, the order of language or the rules of language, whereas the signified series arranges a produced totality, the acquisition of knowledge in his example. He then shifts to the literary example of Robinson Crusoe, which you wouldn't necessarily know. He just calls it Robinson's paradox. But if you know that there's an appendix in Logic of Sense that's based on an updated version of that story by Deleuze's friend Michel Tournier, which is called Friday or the Other Island. And the example he gives is that Robinson Crusoe lands on a desert island all by himself at first, nothing there but wild nature. But to keep his sanity, he tries to continue living as an English gentleman according to all the rules of English society. This is the preliminary totality. These rules are only exist within Robinson Crusoe. And that's the signifier of how he's attempting to live. The signified is his battle against nature to try to produce the totality, which he does incrementally. His battle against nature goes step by step in his efforts to live according to an English gentleman. Deleuze quickly then segues into a look at social rules in general, starting with law, or the rule of law, which is a preliminary totality that weighs heavily upon its object before even the object is known. And he'll compare political and economic totalities with technical progress. So, and he'll say that revolutions don't derive from technical progress. Rather, revolutions come in the gap between political and economic totalities and its relation to technical progress, the disequilibrium between political totalities, economic totalities, and technical progress. And he'll say there are two errors. One is the error of reformism, which is changing things according to technical progress, using technical progress as a reason to change things. And the other error is totalitarianism, which attempts to keep political and economic totalities exactly as they are now without the ability to change. Deleuze is saying the revolution comes in the gap between the two. And I'll just quickly read something from it. He'll say, but the revolutionary lives in the gap which separates technical progress from social totality and inscribes there the dream of permanent revolution, a change in society for the better, which we can call, looked at from the personal point of view, this isn't quoting from the book, but looked at from the personal point of view, we can call transformation. So regarding revolution in general, though, he has a sentence that very much could be easily applied to magic, which is that this dream, therefore, is itself action, reality, and an effective menace to all establishment order. It renders possible what it dreams about. So in other words, he's saying that intentionality is reality also. Deleuze then goes back to Levi-Strauss, talking about the two types of series, and how earlier we called the signifier series had an empty place, an extremely mobile empty place. Levi-Strauss calls this a floating signifier. It's this floating signifier, what Deleuze calls the empty place, is the servitude of all finite thought, but also the promise of all art, all poetry, all mythic and aesthetic invention. This is the excess in the signifier series, or he just was talking about the dream of revolution. So this is the excess where you try to come up with some art or an idea for something that eventually, you try to produce something based on trying to signify something, and it's the excess of the signifier, the attempt to signify something that is the promise of all art. Okay, then Deleuze gets into the nitty-gritty of defining the structure of sense, of how sense gets produced. And he'll talk about it always has to be two heterogeneous series, the signifier and the signified, and that how these are related, they communicate to each other via a paradoxical element. And it's this element, this circulating paradoxical element, that produces the excess in the signifier series and the lack in the signified series. So the terms of the series are singularities, and he'll bring in differential calculus, which I don't know differential calculus. You only need to know what it is in a very basic general way, which is attempts to describe the rate of change between one particular event or singularity and another. There's no structure without these series of singular events which maintain relations with each other. This is what creates the structure that produces sense. Sense is in both series of the signifier and the signified at the borderline between the two. And he'll say that there's no structure without the empty square. This is the thing that circulates between the two series. And we can see that this chapter and chapters 6 and 7 are kind of a cluster that all relate to each other and go together, which is the clue I mentioned to the structure of this book is in the first paragraph of this chapter. He talks about Levi-Strauss for a couple of sentences, and then he says something that I believe is a literary trick. I'll just quote it. As the hero of Cosmos says, there are always too many signifying signs. Now, Cosmos is capitalized and in italics as if it's the title of a book. One assumes Cosmos is the name of a book that he's referring to. However, there's no attribution, there's no footnote saying who wrote this book, where it comes from. I assumed it was a book by Levi-Strauss, but upon researching that, there is no such book called Cosmos by Levi-Strauss. You have no idea what he's referring to by that one sentence. And so shortly after is when he goes to the sort of Robinson paradox, talking about Robinson Crusoe. So if you were to be on a desert island with only this book, and you read that sentence about Cosmos, the hero of Cosmos, he's, to me, in my opinion, he's referring back to chapter 6 to James Joyce, because the last time he used the word cosmos was talking about the two series in Finnegan's Wake of cosmos being the signifier and chaos being the signified. And so another clue is the hero of Cosmos can refer to James Joyce, because one of Joyce's earlier books, which was kind of autobiographical in nature, was called Stephen Hero, which he eventually, Joyce kind of abandoned, and it became Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And I've said previously that James Joyce is central to logic of sense, to his theory of logic of sense. And I also mentioned how Series 6 correlates with the sixth Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, Tifereth. And we can see also chapter 6 is the sixth series of serializations. Now remember, I said that Tifereth is the only sphere on the Tree of Life that's directly connected to all the other spheres except for Malkuth, which it's indirectly connected. And here we have the sixth series of serializations, which is kind of directly connected to every chapter in this book, because, as I mentioned in the introduction, every chapter is a series. So the sixth series of serialization does connect to every chapter in this book, every series in this book, serialization and series. This sentence is kind of interesting when you think of it in those terms, which is when he's talking about structure. No structure without series and relations between the terms of each series, or without singular points corresponding to these relations. And I'll just close off by talking a little bit about structure. So experiential structure is what allows you to go from where you are now to where you want to be. So an esoteric structure is the Tree of Life and Kabbalah. But we can look at it in more simpler terms. For instance, if you wanted to write a song, you wanted to express something musically, you would use the structure of musical notation, generally the Western musical scale, use those rules to make something musical, to make something a song. We can even look at this in extremely mundane terms, that if you are at home and you want to drive downtown, you want to get from where you are now to where you want to be downtown, getting groceries or something. In California, you would get into your car and you would you would use the structure of the rules of the road, the traffic that would enable you, driving on the right side of the road, stopping at red lights and stop signs, etc. That's a particular structure that allows you to get from where you are at home to where you want to be at the grocery store. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.